Good morning and welcome to this morning's REF webinar on the Developing Policy on Staff and Outputs. My name is Claire, I'm a member of the Research Policy team and I will be managing the questions this morning and we'll be kind of trying to group the questions into themes. So we will try and cover quite a number of them throughout this morning's presentation. Kim will outline further the ways that you can continue to get in touch with us later in the presentation, and a recording will be available of the webinar on the HEFCE website, hopefully tomorrow. So if you're unable to attend or want to share with colleagues, then you're very welcome to forward the link. And final comment from me, if you would like to tweet throughout this morning's presentation, please use hashtag REF2021. So I'll hand over to Kim to kick us off.
Good morning. My name is Kim Hackett. I'm the REF manager at HEFCE, and I'm here with David Sweeney.
Hi, I'm the Director for Research and Knowledge Exchange at HEFCE, also Executive Chair of Citizen Research England. We're moving into that. I'm delighted to be here with Kim, who is the woman who knows about the REF. I'm also delighted to be here with you. We're so grateful for the number of consultation responses and the engagement there's been in all sorts of discussions around the sector, but we're delighted here to unveil some of our latest thinking, seeking more input from you.
Thanks, David. So I'll just briefly start by outlining the structure of what we want to do today. So we're going to take each of these two key issues outlined on this first slide, starting with the approach for submitting staff who have a significant responsibility to undertake research. We'll go through our developing approach on this, and then we'll pause to address any questions or comments that you have submitted as we've been talking. Then we'll move on to discuss developing policy on output portability, again taking questions and comments after we have been through the proposals. The emphasis of today is on setting out the principles underpinning our approach and what it is overall that we're seeking to achieve, and for portability in particular, to open this for discussion and reflection, through which we will be able to collect some detailed comments and views from you. And on both issues, as Claire said, we welcome feedback. There are two blogs that will accompany the webinar today, one of which has been published this morning on staff, submitting staff. Another is due on portability later this week. So do also comment on those blog posts, and we'll give you the email address at the end of the session again to send your comments and views in by email. What I want to do first is touch on a bit of the background briefly before handing over to David to make a start on submitting staff in the exercise. So we ran our consultation earlier this year. This set out detailed proposals across the exercise, both implementing the recommendations set out in the Stern review, as well as wider points of detail reflecting our evaluation findings. We had a really broad set of responses, and as David noted, we'd like to thank you for those responses. And in a number of areas, these identified support for the proposals we set out to feed into our development of our initial decisions, which will enable us to set those out in the coming weeks on some aspects of the exercise. But it also identified particular areas of concern or divided opinions, and these primarily centred on our proposals for submitting staff and outputs. It was evident from the responses we received that we needed to engage further to address the concerns and points raised to develop the policy here. We started this in June, meeting with a number of groups, and this has fed into the approaches that we will be outlining today. So I'm going to hand over now to David to discuss the first of our key issues for an overview of the Stern recommendation, the feedback we've received, and the funding body's position.
So what did the consultation responses say? There was indeed broad support for the Stern recommendation to include all staff with significant responsibility to carry out research. That did not surprise me at all, because whenever I talked to people, I got a very positive endorsement of the proposal. What I think were Stern's key aims in making that suggestion? I think, firstly, Stern was concerned about the negative consequences for individual staff, for their careers and for their morale if they were omitted from the exercise. And that is a comment that was made widely following the last exercise, and we've seen it made with previous exercises. So I think it's a strong and sharp comment and led to the proposal. Stern also commented that the ability for universities to select staff didn't give a sufficiently well-rounded view of the research activity. And different people have characterised that in different ways. Cherry picking their best work to influence the results, a frequent comment made. Not, of course, to influence the funding outcomes, because the mechanisms make sure that doesn't happen, but certainly influences the way some people read the results. And we saw in the last exercise a mix of submission behaviour from staff, some institutions submitting pretty much all of their eligible staff, some whose mission perhaps was different, supporting a relatively small number of staff, but I think some particular criticism aimed at those who were essentially research-focused institutions, but they omitted 20, 30% of their staff, with a perception, I think, from others that was to gain a particular advantage, and game playing was the word that was frequently bandied around. So again, the Stern comment, I think, the Stern proposal did capture the things that people around the sector had been saying. The consultation responses, as I say, accepted the principle generally, that including all staff made sense. Many comments about restricting game playing, which I think everybody seems to abhor. There are quite a lot of people still managed to try to find ways to do it. We also got some very strong feedback about the proposals we made. The proposal that we should use contract status alone was not supported at all, but with some very helpful comments about the reasons why people may be on contracts that involve teaching and research, but in fact have no significant responsibility to undertake research. Part of that is historical and the way in which standard contracts were used in some parts of the sector. So although contract status may be a starting point for eligibility, we accept the consultation responses, which said strongly that it wasn't fit for the purpose of selecting staff. There was broad support for limiting the submission to independent researchers. That's not that significantly different from last time. I'm not going to dwell on that now, but very strong concerns about using cost centres to allocate staff members to units of assessment. This was an attempt to eliminate further game playing, people choosing to put people into cognate units of assessment, but perhaps concentrating their strong people in one. But I think the arguments that were made around the lack of academic coherence and the way that didn't adequately represent what staff did, those were compelling arguments, and we're therefore not taking forward the use of cost centres. Also, around submitting staff, there was support for weakening the link between staff and submitted outputs, essentially varying the number of outputs that were required of people rather than a standard 4 for established staff members, with lower numbers for those who were early career or had special circumstances. Strong support for not being as direct about the number 4, and really quite a lot of feedback, particularly in the light of including all staff, about whether we had adequately captured the equality and diversity issues around staff selection. And those struck home to us because we're very aware of the fact that we have problems around equalities and diversity in the whole research process. And the REF, along with a range of other tools, give some ways in to tackling that issue. So what did the funding bodies take from the consultation responses? Well, let's just start with the straight statement that the funding bodies accept Stern's recommendation. We aim to address the negative effects that he mentioned, and we accept that staff submission should change, so it's not about any judgment of performance. Those submitted should be those engaged in activity, those who indeed do have a significant responsibility for research. We accept Stern, we will implement that, but of course the difficult issue is that there's no clear alternative to contractual status for easily identifying staff with a significant responsibility to undertake research. And I think it's fair to say we've done a lot of talking to people looking for ways through this conundrum. Kim will outline where we wish to go in a moment, but I think there is no simple way through that just gives you a magic way of identifying appropriate staff. That is a collective problem for us all to address. Now, alongside addressing that, we of course are aware of the comments both before the consultation from those who responded to the evaluation work we undertook following the last REF, and also in the consultation about the need to address burden concerns wherever possible, to cut the burden where possible. Just occasionally we get a sense of hollow laughter from people that it isn't possible to address the burden issues. So we want to propose very specific things that universities can do, should they wish, to cut the burden that they face. We are taking head on the need to sacrifice some things in order to cut burden, seeking to address burden concerns in developing the proposal specifically to address the eligible staff, that is, those who have significant responsibility for research. Kim, you're the woman who knows. Tell us how our thinking is developing.
Okay, thanks, David. I'd like to start with what we see as our starting point, which actually is similar to the criteria for eligibility in 2014. So this slide outlines the staff within scope to be eligible for inclusion in the REF. This includes academic staff with an employment function of teaching research or research only. As David noted, support in the consultation for independence, and it's argued that staff included should be independent researchers. We will again start with the 2014 definition here, but in response to consultation feedback, we'll be seeking to refine this, and that's particularly to address concerns raised about how it applied across the spread of disciplines in the previous exercises, so seeking to tweak the definition there. As in 2014, and supported in the consultation feedback, staff should be included where they are on a minimum contract of 0.2 FTE. We will also need there will also be a need for a substantive connection for staff to the submitting institution. And in some cases, this may need to be evidenced through a statement to describe that connection of the staff member to the submitting institution. And that also was supported for staff on those minimum fractional contracts in the consultation when we asked that question. So these are who is in scope. It's our expectation that for many research-intensive institutions, this will also accurately capture the majority of staff who have a significant responsibility to undertake research. Therefore, and mindful of the burden, as David outlined, we will seek to provide an option for these institutions to forego the burden of setting up processes to identify staff for inclusion and provide an option for 100% return. We recognise that there may well be some differences by discipline area in the extent to which all staff may be considered to have a significant responsibility, and it's our proposal, therefore, that the 100% option should be operational at unit of assessment level. For those institutions or those units where the initial set of criteria I outlined do not accurately capture the staff who have a significant responsibility for research, there will be an alternative option available. Now, this is premised on the basis that all staff meeting those criteria will be included, except where there is auditable evidence that they do not have the significant responsibility, for example, with reference to career pathways or workload models. It will be necessary for institutions to develop and set out processes for identifying staff for inclusion on this basis, which will need to include discussion and agreement between the institution and staff, will need to be set out and consulted on with academic staff in a code of practice, and that code of practice is submitted for approval to the funding body and will thereafter be published. It's our view that there should be no requirement for this process to include a discussion of contractual status, and we would expect codes of practice to be clear on that point.
You'll pick up from what Kim says that this develops the proposals that I made in a blog posting in March. However, we are so aware that running a process like this is an issue of burden. So we want to make clear that for those universities who have a serious research mission and who consider that most of their academics therefore have a significant responsibility for research, there is simply no need to run such a process. You just submit all of your staff. In the discussions I had with the steering group, it was clearly their view that there were many universities where the mission was of that nature and where the staff had an expectation to the significant responsibilities for research. Those universities who may like to consider themselves research intensive, that's a decision, a classification for them to adopt, not one we would adopt. We would encourage to go for 100% burden because, as we will explore, the consequences of including a handful of staff in the exercise who perhaps may have a less significant responsibility is a lot less than it was in the last exercise. So the question, the core question, is whether you want to accept 100% submission and do not have to go through a process, or whether you go through a process and in due course in the webinar we'll talk a little bit more about how that might work. Kim.
Okay, so the final area related to submission of staff and outputs is around the decoupling of staff from the outputs in the submission, which David outlined at the start as part of Stern's recommendation on submission of staff, direct link between staff and outputs. And as noted, it received support in the consultation, and we do intend to implement it in order to give institutions that flexibility around building their submissions. The average number of outputs that will be required to be submitted for each staff member to give the total number of outputs the unit will need to submit can only be determined when we have a clearer idea of the total size of the staff pool to be submitted, given that our intention is to keep roughly the same number of outputs overall submitted to the exercise as was submitted in 2014. And that's really to recognise the workload that there is on the panels, and that in 2014 the number of outputs returned was appropriate for the panels to manage in the assessment approach they took. The consultation sought views on that point, and collect a bit more evidence on the expected number of staff to be returned in order to determine that number, but that will be part of our initial decisions on these issues that we intend to set out in the autumn. However, we do have a recommendation on the minimum number, and this really reflects concerns raised in the consultations around the representativeness of submissions and the increased support for introducing a minimum of one output to be submitted per staff member included, where a revised approach to identifying staff is implemented. That is also the view of the funding bodies, as we are taking an approach which enables institutions to ensure they can identify those staff who have a significant responsibility, that a minimum of one is appropriate. It's also our view that the codes of practice previously mentioned would also set out the institution's approach to selecting outputs in order to further underpin the measures to support quality and diversity in the exercise. Additional to that, there would be reductions in that minimum of one for staff included in submissions where certain circumstances apply, and they would be, we would seek to work with EDAP as far as possible to keep the information requirements as minimal as possible around that, that option. And finally, we intend to include in the environment statement some data on the unit's output profile in terms of its representativeness. So how many outputs roughly equate to how many staff in David?
We're going to move on to questions at the moment, and Claire is sitting looking at the things you're asking online, but I'd like to pick up from some tweets just before we move to the question. Andy Dixon says 100% option will lower burden for research intensives. Others use alternative option, more burden perhaps for those HEIs. I think that is a very fair question to ask, and one we've thought about, and in preparing this proposal, talked to quite a number of people who helpfully act as sounding boards for us. We understand that there are quite a number of institutions who have ways already of agreeing with their staff what the responsibility the staff have is, and the staff understanding what they're expected to do. Often those come out as career pathways. Sometimes there's transparent and open workload models. And I think for those institutions that have already engaged with their staff in those kind of discussions, the burden should not be significant, and analogous anyway with decisions those universities take around submission in previous exercises where it's very much been who is playing a significant role in research in the institution. I think there will be some universities where there's a lack of clarity around the expectation of staff. I also note the point that is made by John Elms from the Times Higher that there's a lot about discussion, about agreement between staff and institutions. Well, of course, the employment relationship, changes to the employment relationship are a matter of agreement between the staff and the staff member and the university. The university can't make unilateral changes to what people are asked to do without consideration and consultation. So yes, we are emphasising the need to consult and discuss with that. In some institutions that will have been less well developed in the past, and we would indeed encourage them to do so now, but not with any need on our part to have this captured in a contractual status. We think that's somewhere which is not responsible to the funding bodies to address, and something that if it is going to be addressed in an institutional environment, it has to be done over a period of time. So we are looking for transparent ways of representing the discussions, but not capturing them in a contractual status. Claire, do you have questions for us?
Yes, so we do. Thanks both. Just to confirm that we will be circulating the slides after the webinar, and they will be available to download on the website, on the HESKI site, so do take a look at that. So I think to start, we'll kick off with questions about 100% how we define 100% submission. So there's been a question about, will there be a census date? Will HESA returns be used? Will it be audited? And also whether institutions will have to declare well in advance of their submission whether they're adopting the 100%. So if you could pick those up, that would be great.
Sure, Kim will pick up some of the details, but I do want to make clear that this webinar, is about setting out the principles and listening to the questions rather than us outlining a very detailed set of requirements for how the exercise will be carried out. We will be expecting a discussion following this webinar that goes on through into September, where there'll be an opportunity to capture all of those issues, and after that we'll identify the details of the proposals, and indeed at that point I think the decisions. So I'm going to hand to Kim now to answer, but I don't think we are going to nail down every detail of how this will work today, because that wouldn't be in the spirit of consultation.
Thanks, David. Absolutely. So it's our sort of working position that 100% would apply to staff employed on census date, and that would be determined according to the HESA data that's available there to audit. But as David indicated, the full details are there to be developed in time. I think there's a related question around whether an institution that decided to go for the 100% route would need a code of practice, and that's I think that there's a clear need to have, for all institutions to have a code of practice around the selection of outputs. I think that it would need to reference what it's intending to do around the inclusion of staff, and of course, if that is to go for 100% route, the detail in the code of practice will be minimal in that sense. But of course, it may be that that doesn't apply across all units of assessment, and in which case the institution would need to set out the differences that there are there.
Fab. Just picking up some of the other questions around definitions. So a couple of questions we've received about when are we going to be able to clarify the definitions of what's meant by independent researchers, and what data will need to be provided. And obviously we're saying that we're not in a position where we're able to answer detailed questions, but could you give an indication about that?
Sure. Okay. So in 2014, we had it was the case that research assistants were not eligible to be returned except where they met the definition of being an independent researcher. It would be that would be again our position, and the definition of independent researcher was broadly along the lines of being having the relevant academic employment function of teaching research or research only, and equivalent to holding or leading a research grant or being a PI on that grant was broadly the definition in 2014. And I think some of the concerns raised were around that definition and how applicable it was across the range of disciplines in order to identify who met the definition of an independent researcher. So we'd need to work with the REC panels when they are established in order to ensure that any discipline interpretation of a generic definition of research independence was appropriate for that discipline area.
Great, thanks, Kim. I think another one that's worth just clarifying is we've had a question whether we're in a position to be able to tell institutions about the average number of outputs yet, and when further details will be announced, and whether there's still a plan for something to be announced in August. Okay,
so the average number of outputs. So in 2014, we had 4 per staff member in the Stern review based on the data that we had on who would potentially be eligible on those P&R or R only contracts. We have an average of 2. So we are, with a revised definition of staff, we're looking at somewhere between the number of staff returned in 2014 and that total pool. And we will be able to determine exactly what that is when we have further data on the number of staff that institutions anticipate returning. But that cannot be determined at this point. But it's somewhere in the region of the total staff pool between those two numbers.
And we recognise that where universities opt for 100% submission, we'll have a clear view on the number of staff submitted. I think universities have to have time to consider whether that burden-free alternative is the one that they would choose and what the consequences are. I think for those universities who have staff in some number, who don't have a significant responsibility for research, they've got to be allowed time to work that through, and particularly if there are to be discussions with the staff, which we are signalling very strongly, then there's got to be time to carry that out. So we may well run an early exercise to get an indication, but there is no way that we are going to pin universities down to decisions. Just as in previous rounds, we've asked for some indications of numbers submitted, but that is purely indicative, and universities take their own decision. We'll use that kind of information to determine how many outputs are required in the submissions.
And just on the question around August, yes, there are going to be some aspects of the framework initial decisions announced in the coming weeks, but it won't be the aspects that we're discussing today, given that we are, as noted, in consultation on this point.
So, Helen Louise Young, since you asked on Twitter, there will be discussions on some issues through to September, but the initial decisions will come out before then and give you as much information as we're able, recognising that if we're going to something that gets the best of your input, there are those matters which require a little bit longer. But we recognise we can't step outside Hefty Central without being told that universities are very, very keen to know the details of the scheme. We accept that, but we also want to ensure that we've worked with you to get the scheme as good as it can be.
Fab. So there's a couple about at what level is the 100%? So can institutions decide at an individual UOA level or at an institutional level whether to submit 100%? And can they submit? Can they choose to submit no one in an individual UOA?
Well, we have talked to indeed some vice chancellors about this, and we do understand that there are universities who have a clear research mission and who one might suspect would opt for 100% submission. But indeed, in my own university, quite a time ago, we had a department that included a lot of practitioners. Practice was the focus of the work, and very clearly those who did not undertake research that fitted in with the REF definition. We think, therefore, there has to be an option for some units of assessment to have a different policy to perhaps most of the units of assessment. It's only fair, and again, we'll work the details out on that over the next couple of months. I think if you truly have an academic unit where no one has a significant responsibility for research, then I think you'll be able to submit no one. That should be fairly obvious in many ways. And we must work with universities on this. We'll have appropriate audit processes in due course. I think if you choose to submit no one in an academic unit, it should be pretty clear from the evidence that there's not research focus on that department.
Okay, thank you. And I think we will move on there, but we will be downloading all of your questions and considering them as part of an ongoing conversation. So thank you for those that have submitted questions, and they will be considered throughout the process.
Okay, thanks very much. So now we're going to move on to the second area for discussion today, which is around output portability. And I'm again going to hand over to David to give us the background on Stern's aim and the funding body's position.
The portability of outputs is a challenge. We've got very polarized views on the portability of outputs, more so than on staff selection, and the views held by those polar opposites are usually expressed, shall we say, forcefully, and perhaps without much belief that those who hold the opposing view have got credible arguments. It's therefore quite difficult to achieve a consensus, and we think that there are credible arguments on both sides. The Stern view highlighted two issues with the outputs being portable, as they have been in the last few exercises. There was a lack of reward for institutions who had invested in their staff, both in salaries and facilities, in staff development. They then lost any credit for the fruits of that investment when academics left in the latter part of the cycle and, as they say, took their outputs with them. It should be clear this is not about ownership or copyright. Really, it's about who gets the credit for the outputs. We certainly think that Stern point is a very, very strong one. Of course, we believe in staff development. Of course, we want our universities to build teams and support them. So to undermine that by not giving any credit is a criticism that's a challenge to address. There's also the issue around staff recruitment and particularly retention, that you face the choice. Do you, perhaps when faced with a staff member who is a competing offer from another institution, do you face the challenge of matching a salary just so that you retain the credit for those outputs? Or do you accept that perhaps that member of staff, who of course has the freedom to move where they will, should be allowed to go and pursue their career elsewhere, but therefore with a penalty to you? There's a lot of discussion around the sector on wage inflation, salary inflation, based on this element of the policy. Relatively limited evidence about the effect or about the size of the effect. And also, of course, bear well in mind that if high performers receive an offer from another university, it's part of the way the employment system works that any employer will recruit staff with talent, being willing to pay them the reward that they think their work determines. Nevertheless, I think those two Stern criticisms are very significant. From the consultation responses, there was actually a significant minority who supported the Stern proposal to no longer make outputs portable, and a small majority who thought the effects of the proposal were actually worse than the benefits from the proposal, who were very concerned particularly about the timing in the cycle of making the change, and very concerned also about some of the practical issues there were around the implementation. And those points, as I say, were forcefully expressed. I would say, however, that those who essentially supported the status quo and did not agree with the Stern recommendations, they didn't make much progress in addressing the Stern concerns. They just mostly said they weren't significant enough compared with the change, the results of the change. Kim, you're the woman who knows what's happening.
Sure. So from the point of view of the funding bodies, it's clear that we need to recognise those points made by CERN and that credit is given to the originating institution, but also to recognise those concerns that have been raised in the consultation and implement transition rearrangements for this exercise with a clear approach to review the arrangements put in place for this exercise in order to consider the arrangements for exercises hereafter. So we have been discussing with various groups potential approaches to transition rearrangements and how we could best address both those concerns raised in the consultation as well as the clear principles aimed at by Stern. And what has become clear is that again, this is an area where there may be a trade-off with complexity and burden to address them all absolutely. And I've got a slide here in a moment which will go through that hybrid model, which I think does adequately address all of those points, but which may introduce some level of complexity for institutions. So we are seeking views on really which approach is preferable. One that will deliver the address all of those different things, or actually one that addresses the complexity and burden as well in a simplified approach, but in one which there is less precision. So in this approach, it would be the case that both the originating and the new institutions would be eligible to submit. The institution where the staff member has left but they've been employed with a responsibility for research in the period, where the outputs have been done, it should be generated there, should submit the outputs, and it's our expectation that many of these outputs would in fact be captured in institutional repositories. That's recognising, as David has outlined, the concerns that have been raised and the point at which we are in the cycle. We also propose that in this model, for this exercise, the receiving institution could also return the outputs of their currently employed staff members. It's argued that this would both take account of certain concerns as well as the sector responses to the consultation, but of course would involve some double counting of outputs with both institutions as able to return the outputs of staff members they had employed. It may be that this is well offset by achieving the reduction in burden through a simpler approach.
We're critically aware that already a large number of outputs are double or even triple counted, because where there's multiple authorships, we don't share the credit from the output among the different institutions. So double counting is already a feature of the exercise. I noticed from the tweets concern that the originating institution submitting the output is additional burden, but if you've been storing the details in your repository, then there's actually no burden at all over and above collecting the information about outputs you do anyway. And of course, we've got to think how we handle different forms of output, practice-based outputs, for example. So the originating institution submitting, we think, is not an enormous burden, and giving for this exercise a simple approach of credit also to the receiving institution is exactly the same process as we worked last time, so no additional burden. For us, this is a low burden. We're not suggesting it's a no burden option. It's a low burden option that addresses the issue about the originating institution not losing credit, leaves it open to deal with staff who are interested in moving, taking a decision based on the long-term return, the potential from the member of staff, rather than the short-term need to harvest outputs, but yet still encouraging those institutions who want to hire staff not just to gain a credit or ref, but taking on a long-term salary cost in order to support the staff, able to do that. So no hindrance to mobility, which was one of the comments made in the consultation responses. That is a low burden option, but with a degree of imprecision. What about the alternative, Kim?
Well, David, I shall tell you. Okay, so our alternative model seeks to introduce a fuller form of non-portability, still one in which concerns around, for example, the effects on early career researchers or those on fixed-term contracts could be addressed, and particularly around mobility, but would seek to implement this from a forward date to account for those concerns about retrospective applications. So this would involve, therefore, the operation of two rules in the publication period, determined by the point at which staff are recruited by institutions. So in essence, those institutions who are recruiting staff or where staff are leaving after the commencement date of the new rules would be, in fact, under the new rules. This would allow some limited portability, so that institutions receiving staff could, those staff members could take perhaps one or two outputs with them, and the old institution where the staff member left after the commencement date of the new rules would be able to submit all of those that had been demonstrably generated at that institution as determined by the point at which the outputs had been made publicly available while the staff member was based at that institution. So, while this model answers in detail the range of aims of the term review and the concerns raised around portability, and it would also have built into it a number of measures to avoid lost outputs, for instance, if staff move institutions around the point of the commencement date, the feedback that we've had on this model suggests that it would be complex to operate within institutions and in that case would bring with it considerable burden.
So I think we have really on both staff submission and on portability a choice for institutions. There's a lower burden option for staff submission that may mean the inclusion of a handful of people who do not have a significant responsibility for research. On portability, it will mean a degree of double counting. The question really is that reduction in burden justified by the does it justify the loss of precision that's involved in the results? This is I think, a serious challenge to universities. We are trying to produce low burden. We are trying to live up to the Stern proposals. The choice is there for universities. Most of the cost of this exercise is in universities. It's not for the government. It's not for HEFCE, but it is a very significant cost in universities. So do you want universities to choose an option that is lower burden? And I realise that for some institutions on staff selection, probably they have to go through a degree of burden because they are nowhere near 100% submission for staff. I accept that, but the alternative indeed would be to require them to submit all staff, and that would seem unfair to me on a number of grounds. So proposals that we hope will tease through. I think we're looking forward to some questions on outputs and on portability, non-portability, and particularly comments about complexity versus simplicity.
Okay, so just to kick off the questions, just because it's come up a few times, so given the nature of ongoing discussions, are the funding bodies now committed to REF 2021, or might this become REF 2022? Now, that's a question that's been asked a couple of times, so David, can you give your...
It's REF 2021, that date has been set for the government, and indeed, I don't consider, given the point where in the cycle and comparing it with last time, that there's any need to extend the timetable at all. The general principle is the same. You're going to submit good outputs, you have to publish outputs, and I think for many universities, the submission of staff is straightforward. For others, it's really not significantly less straightforward than it was before, other than perhaps a greater degree of staff engagement, which is surely a good thing. REF 2021.
Thanks, David. Okay, so we have had a question about whether the burden option for the low burden option for portability, whether it actually addresses academics holding off publishing, and if there's any thoughts about whether the transfer market or has been used, that term in the past, transfer market, will still exist. Have you got any comments on that?
Well, I think transfer market's a bit of a pejorative term. At any point in the cycle, universities will choose to attempt to hire new staff. Right through this cycle, we've seen some significant investments from universities who are looking to build their research performance. And I think if you look at those who try and do it systematically, there's a lot happens in the early period of the cycle because they're looking to develop strong teams. I don't think giving credit to both should make a significant difference to the transfer area. I think you can hire new staff, that is great, but you are taking on a responsibility to fund those staff for a considerable period. It's not as if you're doing something that's very short term. I think we look forward to further comments on that. I think this is see as a midway path between issues around the transfer market.
Thanks, David. So we have had a few questions about what happens with someone on the hybrid portability model who moves institution more than once within one ref cycle.
On the hybrid portability model, the eligibility for outputs would be determined in relation to when they moved. So if they moved before the commencement of the new rule, the old 2014 rules would apply, and the institution currently employing the staff member on the census date would get credit for the outputs. If they moved, and whether that's once or multiple times, and those moves were after the commencement of the new rule, then the outputs would be eligible to be submitted by institutions where they have been demonstrably generated, and staff members could take with them up to 2 outputs, is the suggestion, to the institution that is employing them on the census date.
Great, thanks, Kim. So a question about what modelling's been done on the 2 options, and whether there will be any opportunity for institutions, or whether we're going to ask institutions to vote on the 2 options.
No. Consultations don't work by voting. They work by us analysing the not the strength of the response, but the coherent argument in the response. So, as I said, those who responded saying they weren't so keen on the Stern proposals didn't actually, in my view, satisfactorily address the force in the Stern argument that the originating institution lost credit. I think in taking the final decisions here, we will listen to the arguments. We'll look at those who make particularly incisive points. But in the end, someone's got to take the decision, and that's the decision for the funding bodies collectively, not HEFCE, but our colleagues in Wales, Ireland and Scotland are very active with us on this.
Yes, we have been looking at the implications of the both sets of models. Some of the data we have makes it difficult to model fully. For instance, it's quite difficult to capture staff who have made multiple moves across the period. So whatever we're looking at the data can only give us an indicative picture.
And I think just one final question before we move on. And as I said earlier, we're not able to get through all of the questions, but they will be considered. So Kim or David, how about, so this is a question, can originating institutions pick and choose which former staff outputs they can submit? Or would former staff who are research active need to be represented in a submission?
Yeah, that's a good point. So it's not our proposal that there would need to be a minimum of 1 output return for every staff member the institution had employed throughout the period who met the definition. That would apply only to those staff who were employed on the census date. So yes, in effect, in answer to the question, it would be up to the institution as part of their approach to selecting the outputs they want to return to the exercise to select which of those that they had invested in from staff that have since left.
We haven't dwelt, I think, in this webinar on the Stern principle, because we've concentrated those two issues. The Stern principle, this should be much more around the institutional submission than around the individuals. And although we do think that if you're being submitted, there should be, in order to give a rounded view, 1 output from the 7 years or so of work, and we will, in extreme circumstances, have exceptions to that. We do think that it is about selecting the work that represents the unit in your institution. So there may be that will draw on those who have left. It'll draw on those who are there, and you will choose a greater number than 1. I'm not sure whether we've said 5 or 6. Kim, have we said that?
We haven't said.
I don't think I was supposed to mention that, was I? So we haven't quite got there on that. But several, more than 4, shall we say, outputs from those who you think deliver a strong set of research for you.
So thanks again for all your questions, and we will make sure that the slides are available hopefully tomorrow, but certainly by the end of the week if you want to see them on the HEFCE website.
Claire, we're going to encourage them to keep tweeting, because
certainly.
We are going to follow the tweets. We will also be having a number of other ways in which we gather information. If you feel that nobody's listening to you, Kim Hackett would love to get your email. She's now shooting me. Claire.
Yes. So I'll just finish off by summing up really how you can send us your further thoughts, comments, questions, feedback. So as we've noted, there are some blog posts that set out some of the content that we've gone through today. The one on submitting staff has been published today, and of course you can engage in discussion through the comment facility on that blog post. We'll also be publishing a further one on portability later this week. You can also email us at researchpolicy@hefce.ac.uk.
You mean not you personally,
Not
Kim?
me personally, although you can if you like, and I will endeavour to respond as well. And we will consider all of your the comments and questions and feedback in developing and continuing to discuss the developing policy in this area. As indicated earlier, we have begun some modelling. We'll continue to do that over the next period to combine with the further discussion activity we're undertaking in order to lead us to those initial decisions on these issues, which we are expecting to announce in the autumn. As we've also noted on the other aspects of the rest, so not related to those aspects we've discussed today, we are working on announcing the initial decisions in the coming weeks. Alongside that, we will also be advertising for our sub-panel chairs. That will then be followed through the rest of the year on the detailed policy development that will eventually lead us to the guidance on submissions early next year, as we then start to appoint the panels in order to develop the criteria. So that provides a bit of an overview of how you can get in touch and our next steps. And I will hand over to Claire to finish.
So just a final note, thank you for listening. And as we've all said, keep talking to us and do engage further. So thanks ever so much, and see you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.